What if the greatest danger of time travel isn't getting lost in the past or trapped in the future? What if the real threat is something far more terrifying? Yourself. These 10 cases document people who allegedly traveled through time, only to become the architects of their own destruction. Some tried to change history, others tried to save themselves, but every single one of them triggered the very death they were trying to escape. Here are their stories. Number 10. The Stockholm Paradox. This case is one of the most chilling examples of what happens when someone receives a warning from the future and chooses to investigate instead of simply walking away. Imagine receiving a letter that saves your life. Now imagine discovering that you wrote it yourself, decades before you were even capable of understanding why. That is exactly what happened to Marcus Lindqvist, and the truth behind that letter would eventually destroy him. In March of 2019, Marcus Lindqvist was a 34-year-old quantum physicist working at Uppsala University in Sweden. He was brilliant, respected, and completely unprepared for what he was about to find. One afternoon, while browsing through an antique bookshop in the old town of Stockholm, he purchased a weathered physics textbook from the 1980s. It was a nostalgic buy, nothing more. But when he opened the book that evening, a folded letter fell out from between the pages. The paper was yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was unmistakably his own. The letter was dated 1987. That was 2 years before Marcus was even born, and yet it contained details that only he could possibly know. His childhood nickname, the scar on his left hand from a bicycle accident when he was 7. His mother's maiden name, the name of his first pet. Every detail was correct. Every word felt like a mirror reflecting his own memories back at him. But the most disturbing part was the warning itself. The letter told him not to board Flight SK441 on March 15th. It said the plane would crash and everyone aboard would die. Marcus checked his calendar. He had already booked that exact flight for a physics conference in Berlin. The ticket was purchased weeks ago. His hands trembled as he read the letter again. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, were 3 final words: destroy the document. He didn't destroy it. Instead, he canceled his flight and spent the following weeks obsessed with understanding how the letter could exist. He traced the paper to a discontinued Swedish manufacturer that stopped production in 1984. The ink matched chemical formulations from that exact era. Every forensic detail confirmed the letter was genuinely old, but that was impossible. How could he have written something in 1987 when he wasn't born until 1989? Flight SK441 departed on March 15th without him. It landed safely in Berlin. There was no crash. Marcus felt relief, then confusion, then something darker. Had the letter been wrong, or had his absence somehow changed the outcome? He became consumed by the mystery. He presented his research on quantum displacement theory via video link instead of attending in person. His work gained recognition. His career accelerated. What Marcus didn't realize was that his survival set everything else in motion. Over the following decades, his research formed the foundation of temporal displacement technology. By 2047, the first successful experiments in backward information transmission were conducted using frameworks he had developed. And by then, Marcus was 62 years old, dying of terminal cancer and desperate for one final experiment. He volunteered to test the system himself. The plan was simple. He would write a letter, encode it with personal details only he could know, and transmit it backward to 1987, where it would be placed inside a book that he knew his younger self would eventually purchase. He believed he was closing a loop, ensuring his own survival, completing a perfect circle of cause and effect. But he made one critical error. He assumed his younger self would stay away from the flight forever. He never anticipated that his younger self would survive, thrive, and eventually become him. The moment Marcus activated the transmission device in 2047, the energy feedback overwhelmed his deteriorating body. His heart stopped. His neurons fired one last cascade of signals, and in his final seconds of consciousness, he saw the letter clearly in his mind. His own handwriting, his own warning, his own death, sealed the moment he decided to send it. Did Marcus save himself, or did he simply choose the timeline in which he would die? The letter didn't prevent his death, it guaranteed it. By surviving the flight, he lived long enough to write the warning that started everything. The loop was never broken, it was completed, and Marcus Lindqvist was both the author and the victim of his own impossible prophecy. Number 9. The Buenos Aires recording. This case is absolutely terrifying, and once you hear it, you'll understand why some secrets are better left buried. Imagine checking your voicemail and hearing your own voice speaking back to you. Not a recording you made, not a message you remember leaving, but your voice, unmistakably yours, speaking in a language that doesn't exist yet. That is exactly what happened to Dr. Elena Vasquez, and her obsession with understanding that message would lead her straight to her own death. In the summer of 2003, Elena Vasquez was a 41-year-old linguist living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She specialized in constructed languages, the artificial systems of communication created for films, novels, and academic experiments. She had spent her career studying how humans build meaning from nothing. But on the morning of June 17th, she encountered something that defied everything she thought she understood. There was a voicemail on her phone. The voice was hers. Older, weaker, but unmistakably hers. And the language it spoke was unlike anything she had ever heard. Elena played the message 17 times that first day. The grammar was logical, structured, clearly not random noise. But the vocabulary matched no known language on Earth. She began transcribing, analyzing, searching for patterns. Over the following months, she decoded fragments, numbers that seemed to be coordinates, a date that translated roughly to December 2006, and one phrase that repeated again and again, which she eventually interpreted as the machine beneath the hospital. She researched the coordinates. They pointed to an empty lot on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, a place where an old psychiatric facility had stood before being demolished in 1976. Construction records showed the building had extended 3 stories underground. Elena became convinced something was buried there, something connected to the impossible message on her phone. In 2005, she convinced a university archaeological team to conduct ground-penetrating radar scans of the site. The results showed metallic anomalies exactly where the basement levels should have been. Something was down there, something large. Elena pushed for excavation permits. She spent months navigating bureaucracy, arguing with skeptics, fighting for access to whatever was hidden beneath the soil. Then the second voicemail arrived. This one was different. The same voice, her voice, but this time filled with terror. She heard herself screaming, gasping, pleading, in that same unknown language. Behind the words was a sound she couldn't identify, a grinding, whirring noise like metal being torn apart from the inside. The message ended abruptly. Silence, then nothing. Any rational person would have stopped. Any rational person would have walked away. But Elena was not rational anymore. She was consumed. In December 2006, after months of excavation, the team finally breached the underground chamber. Elena insisted on entering first. She descended alone into the darkness with only a flashlight and a voice recorder. What she found was a cylindrical device, roughly 2 meters tall, covered in symbols that matched the grammatical structures she had decoded from the voicemails. The metal was cold, impossibly cold, as if it had been frozen for centuries. She reached out and touched it. The moment her fingers made contact, the machine activated. According to the theory that emerged years later, Elena was pulled forward through time, displaced to the year 2147. She spent the next 3 decades there, learning the language of that future civilization, aging, dying slowly from radiation exposure caused by the device. And in her final days, she recorded 2 voicemails and programmed the machine to transmit them backward through time to her own phone in 2003. The first message contained everything she needed to find the machine. The second message was her death, echoing backward through the centuries as a warning that arrived too late. Elena Vasquez was never seen again after entering that chamber. The excavation site was sealed in 2008. The device was never officially cataloged, and all records of the project were classified by the Argentine government. But the voicemails still exist. They sit on a server in Buenos Aires, archived, forgotten, waiting. The cruelest part of Elena's story is this. She was the only person on Earth with the expertise to decode that language. Without her skills, the message would have been meaningless noise. Her knowledge was the key that unlocked her own tomb. And the voice that led her to her death was the same voice she heard every day of her life, her own. Number 8, the duplicate of Detroit. This case is so disturbing that even the investigators who worked on it refused to discuss it publicly for decades. Imagine attending a funeral. You're standing at the graveside, watching the coffin being lowered into the earth, mourning someone you loved. And then that person walks out of the crowd, stumbles toward the grave, and collapses dead at your feet. That is exactly what happened in Detroit in October of 1994, and to this day, no one can explain how one man died twice. James Whitmore was a 52-year-old auto worker who lived in a quiet suburb outside Detroit, Michigan. He had worked at the same factory for 23 years. He had a wife named Dorothy, 2 grown children, and a small circle of friends who gathered every Sunday to watch football. By all accounts, he was an ordinary man living an ordinary life. Until October 3rd, 1994, when he suffered a massive cardiac arrest in his living room and died before the paramedics could reach him. The funeral was held 4 days later at Woodlawn Cemetery. 47 people attended, including co-workers, neighbors, and extended family. Dorothy stood at the front, clutching a handful of white roses, trying to hold herself together as the priest spoke the final prayers. The coffin was polished oak. The weather was gray and cold. Everything was proceeding exactly as funerals do, until a man emerged from the tree line at the edge of the cemetery. He was stumbling, disoriented, pale as ash. His clothes were disheveled, and his eyes were wide with confusion. Several mourners turned to look. A few gasped, because the man walking toward them looked exactly like James Whitmore. Same height, same build, same face, same distinctive scar on his left cheek from a childhood accident. Dorothy screamed. The man pushed through the crowd, his gaze fixed on the coffin. He reached the edge of the grave, stared down at the polished oak lid, and then clutched his chest. His knees buckled. He collapsed onto the grass, his body convulsing once before going still. By the time anyone reached him, he was dead. Cardiac arrest, the same cause of death as the man already in the coffin. Police arrived within the hour. Their initial assumption was fraud, some elaborate scheme involving a twin or a look-alike, but the investigation quickly spiraled into something no one could explain. Fingerprints were taken from the second body. They matched James Whitmore perfectly. Not similar, identical. Dental records matched. Medical scans revealed the same childhood fracture in the left forearm. Even a small mole on the back of his neck was in the exact same position. The medical examiner noted something else. The second body showed signs of rapid cellular degradation, as if it had aged decades in a matter of days. The skin was thin and papery. The organs showed wear consistent with a man in his 80s, not his 50s. Whatever had happened to this second James, time had not been kind to him. In the pocket of his jacket, investigators found a small leather journal. The entries were dated from 2024 to 2031. They described a world 30 years in the future, a government program offering terminally ill patients one chance to revisit any moment in their past. The final entry, dated September 2031, explained everything. James Whitmore, dying of heart failure at age 89, had chosen to return to October 7th, 1994. He wanted to see Dorothy one last time. He wanted to attend his own funeral and watch the people he loved say goodbye. But the displacement process placed enormous stress on his already failing heart. The moment he saw his own coffin, the moment he understood that he was watching his own death, his heart gave out. The same cardiac arrest that killed him in 1994 killed him again in front of his own grave. Dorothy Whitmore never fully recovered. She buried her husband twice in the same week, in the same plot, under the same headstone. The police closed the case without explanation. The coroner's report contained a single handwritten note at the bottom of the page. Cause of death identical. Explanation none. James Whitmore didn't cheat death by traveling through time. He simply chose to experience it twice. And in the end, he died exactly where he was always meant to die. At his own funeral, watching himself be buried. Number 7. The Vienna manuscript. This case reaches back over a century, and yet it remains one of the most haunting examples of a man who read his own death sentence and then unknowingly carried it out himself. Imagine spending years decoding an ancient document, only to discover that the final page contains your own name, the exact date of your death, and the single word that will define how you die. That is exactly what happened to Friedrich Hoffmann, and his desperate attempt to escape that fate is precisely what sealed it. In the autumn of 1889, Friedrich Hoffmann was a respected paleographer at the University of Vienna. He specialized in deciphering ancient texts, translating forgotten languages, and bringing dead words back to life. His reputation was built on patience and precision. So, when he acquired a deteriorated manuscript from a private collector, he approached it the same way he approached everything else: methodically, carefully, without any idea that he was holding his own death in his hands. The manuscript was written in an unknown cipher, dense and intricate, unlike anything Friedrich had encountered before. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a pale brown, and the symbols seemed to shift meaning depending on context. It took him 4 years to decode it. 4 years of sleepless nights, endless notes, and growing obsession. And when he finally understood what he was reading, he wished he never had. The text described future events with impossible accuracy, wars that had not yet been fought, inventions that had not yet been conceived, political upheavals that would not occur for decades. Every prediction Friedrich could verify against known history was correct. The manuscript was not a record of the past. It was a chronicle of the future, written centuries before the events it described. But the true horror waited on the final page. There, in the cipher he had spent years learning to read, was a single name: Friedrich Hoffmann. Beziehnet were coordinates matching his home address in Vienna, a date, November 2nd, 1893, and one word, repeated 3 times: fire. Friedrich's colleagues dismissed him when he tried to explain. They saw a man unraveling, consumed by paranoia, destroyed by his own work. His wife begged him to rest. His friends urged him to burn the manuscript and forget it ever existed. But Friedrich could not let go. He cross-referenced every detail against his own life. The manuscript described his discovery of itself. It described his methods of translation. It described his growing fear, his isolation, his obsession. It was as if someone had watched his entire life unfold and recorded every moment before it happened. By the autumn of 1893, Friedrich had made a decision. If the manuscript predicted his death by fire on November 2nd, then he would prevent it. He would destroy the document before the prophecy could be fulfilled. On the night of November 1st, he carried the manuscript to his study, placed it in the fireplace, and struck a match. The flames caught quickly. Too quickly. The fire spread to the curtains, then the walls, then the wooden beams of the ceiling. Friedrich tried to escape, but the smoke was too thick. The heat was too intense. He collapsed near the doorway of his study at 11 minutes past midnight on November 2nd, 1893. The exact date, the exact location, the exact method. Everything the manuscript had predicted came true because he tried to prevent it. Investigators recovered fragments of the manuscript from the ashes. Most pages were destroyed beyond recognition, but the final page, the one containing his name and the word fire, survived completely intact. It was as if the flames refused to consume the prophecy they had fulfilled. Years later, researchers proposed a theory. Friedrich Hoffmann had been pulled forward in time during the fire, displaced to a distant future where he spent decades documenting everything he remembered. He then arranged for the manuscript to be placed where his younger self would eventually find it. He wrote his own death because he had already experienced it. The fire did not destroy the manuscript. The manuscript created the fire. Friedrich Hoffmann spent 4 years decoding the story of his own destruction, and in the end, he became both the author and the victim, trapped in a loop that he himself had written. Number 6, the Polaroid paradox. This case spans more than 4 decades, and it proves that sometimes the things meant to save us are the very things that destroy us. Imagine opening your mailbox and finding a photograph of your own corpse, your face, your body, your death captured in perfect detail. Now imagine that the camera used to take that photograph will not even be invented for another 40 years. That is exactly what happened to Sarah Chen, and her lifelong attempt to escape that image led her directly into it. In the spring of 1978, Sarah Chen was a 21-year-old student at the University of California, Berkeley. She was studying literature, writing poetry in her spare time, and dreaming of a life far beyond the fog-covered hills of the Bay Area. Her future felt infinite, until the morning she checked her dormitory mailbox and found a photograph that should not exist. The image showed a woman lying crumpled at the base of Sather Tower, the iconic campanile at the heart of campus. The woman's face was turned toward the camera. It was Sarah's face. Older, lined with age, but unmistakably hers. She was wearing a jacket Sarah had never seen before, a deep burgundy coat with brass buttons. The timestamp embedded in the corner of the photograph read 2019. But instant film technology capable of embedding digital timestamps would not exist for another 4 decades. Campus police investigated but found nothing. No fingerprints on the photograph, no witnesses who saw it being delivered, no explanation for how an image from the future had arrived in a college mailbox in 1978. They suggested it was a prank, an elaborate hoax designed to frighten her. Sarah wanted to believe them, but 3 weeks later, her mother sent her a birthday gift, a jacket, deep burgundy with brass buttons, the exact jacket from the photograph. Sarah never wore it. She hung it in the back of her closet and tried to forget. She avoided Sather Tower entirely, walking long detours around campus just to keep the campanile out of her sight. For 18 months, she lived in fear of a death she had already seen. When she graduated in 1980, she left Berkeley and never looked back. She built a life far from California, raised a family, grew old. But she kept the jacket, and she kept the photograph. 41 years passed. In 2019, Sarah Chen received an invitation to her class reunion at Berkeley. She was 62 years old now, a grandmother, a retired professor of comparative literature. Her doctors said she was healthy. Her children said she deserved to finally make peace with the place she had fled. Against every instinct, she decided to go. She packed the burgundy jacket. She told herself it was time to confront the fear that had shadowed her entire adult life. She told herself the photograph was meaningless, a cruel trick that had stolen decades of peace from her. She was done running. On the afternoon of October 12, 2019, Sarah Chen walked toward Sather Tower for the first time in 41 years. She was wearing the jacket, the same jacket from the photograph. As she approached, she looked up at the observation deck and saw a figure standing at the railing, a young woman holding a camera. Sarah squinted against the sun, trying to see the face. The woman looked familiar. The woman looked like family. Sarah climbed the tower. She needed to know. She needed to understand. The stairs were steep, and her heart was pounding by the time she reached the top. The observation deck was empty. The woman was gone. But Sarah's heart did not stop pounding. It raced faster. Then it stuttered. Then it stopped. She fell at the base of the tower, exactly where the photograph had shown her. The jacket, the location, the angle of her body. Everything matched. Investigators later learned that the woman with the camera was Sarah's own granddaughter, a physics student who had discovered temporal displacement technology and traveled back to warn her grandmother. She had taken the photograph to prove the danger was real, hoping Sarah would avoid the tower forever. Instead, the photograph became the obsession that brought Sarah back. The warning did not prevent the death. The warning caused it. And the granddaughter, who tried to save her, had not yet even been born when the photograph first arrived. Number 5. The Moscow Loop. This case takes us deep into the Cold War, into the shadows of Soviet intelligence, where a man's loyalty to his country became the weapon that killed him. Imagine cornering a spy in a dark basement, raising your weapon, and then realizing that the face staring back at you is your own. That is exactly what happened to Colonel Dmitry Volkov, and the bullet he fired that night would eventually find its way back to him. In the winter of 1962, Dmitry Volkov was a decorated officer in the KGB's counterintelligence division. He was ruthless, disciplined, and utterly loyal to the Soviet state. His job was to hunt enemies of the motherland, and he was very good at it. So, when intercepted communications suggested an American operative had infiltrated a classified research facility outside Moscow, Volkov took personal command of the operation. The messages were strange. They referenced projects that Volkov himself oversaw, details that only someone inside his own unit could know. The encryption was unlike anything the Americans had used before. Volkov suspected a mole, someone close, someone dangerous. He coordinated a raid on the facility and insisted on leading the final sweep himself. The basement was cold and dark, lit only by flickering emergency lights. Volkov moved through the corridors alone, his pistol drawn, his breath visible in the frozen air. He heard movement behind a steel door. He kicked it open. A man stood in the shadows, hands raised, face obscured. Volkov ordered him to step forward. When the man moved into the light, Volkov's blood turned to ice. The face was his own. Older, weathered, scarred by years he had not yet lived, but unmistakably his. The same sharp jaw, the same cold eyes, the same small mole beneath the left ear. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected a future he could not comprehend. The older man spoke quickly, desperately. He said he was Dmitry Volkov from the year 1986. He said he had been sent back to prevent his own destruction. In that future timeline, Volkov had been framed for treason by a jealous rival, arrested, tortured, and executed. The only way to stop it was to destroy certain documents before they could be used as evidence. The older Volkov knew details that no imposter could know. Their father's dying words, the name of their first dog, the secret they had never told anyone, not even their wife. But Colonel Volkov had been trained to resist manipulation. He had seen psychological operations before, agents surgically altered to impersonate targets, elaborate deceptions designed to break a man's mind. This had to be another American trick. It had to be, because the alternative was impossible. The older man begged, he pleaded. He said that if the colonel pulled the trigger, he would be killing himself. He would be completing a loop that could never be broken. But Colonel Volkov was not a man who hesitated. He raised his pistol. He aimed at the face that was his own, and he fired. The older man crumpled to the ground, but as the body fell, a device on his wrist began to glow. There was a blinding flash, a sound like tearing metal, and then Colonel Dmitry Volkov was gone. He was no longer in the basement. He was somewhere else, someone else. He materialized in the same facility, but everything was different. The equipment was more advanced. The air smelled of chemicals he did not recognize. And standing in front of him, pistol raised, was a younger man in a KGB uniform, a man with his face, a man with cold eyes and absolute certainty. Volkov understood too late. The treason charges were real. He had been framed in 1985 and escaped execution only by volunteering for an experimental time travel program. He had been sent back to save himself, but his younger self, loyal and suspicious, had seen only an enemy. The colonel did not hesitate. The colonel never hesitated. The bullet struck Volkov's chest. He fell in the same spot where he had killed himself 24 years earlier. The loop was complete. The executioner had become the executed. The hunter had become the prey. Official Soviet records show that Dmitry Volkov died in the line of duty in 1962. But declassified documents from 1986 mention his name on a terminated research project, a project that was never supposed to exist. Number 4, the lighthouse warning. This case takes us to the windswept coast of Ireland, where the line between the living and the dead became impossibly blurred. Imagine standing on a cliff during a violent storm, watching a woman struggle in the waves below. You climb down to save her, and then you realize that the woman drowning in the darkness is you. That is exactly what happened to Eleanor Byrne, and her desperate act of mercy became the instrument of her own destruction. In December of 1923, Eleanor Byrne was a 19-year-old girl living with her father at Fastnet Rock Lighthouse, a remote outpost perched on a jagged island off the southern coast of County Cork. Life at the lighthouse was isolating, defined by the endless rhythm of waves and the mournful cry of seabirds. Eleanor's mother had died years earlier, and her father, a practical man with calloused hands and few words, had raised her to be strong, self-reliant, and unafraid of the dark. But in the weeks leading up to that terrible December night, Eleanor began to see things she could not explain. It started with reflections. She would pass a mirror and glimpse a figure standing behind her, a woman in a white dress with her face obscured by shadow. She would turn, and no one would be there. Then came the footprints, fresh tracks in the dust of the lighthouse stairs, matching her own shoes exactly, appearing in places she had not walked. Her journal entries from that period reveal a young woman slowly unraveling. She wrote of hearing her own voice calling from empty rooms. She wrote of waking in the night to find her bedroom door open, though she always locked it before sleep. She wrote of a growing certainty that she was being followed by something wearing her own skin. Her father dismissed her fears. He attributed them to the isolation, the long winter darkness, the weight of grief that never fully lifted after her mother's death. He arranged for Eleanor to visit relatives in Dublin after Christmas. A change of scenery, he said, would cure whatever ailed her. She just needed to hold on a few more weeks. On the night of December 14th, 1923, a violent storm descended on Fastnet Rock. The wind howled so loudly that Eleanor could barely hear her own thoughts. Rain lashed the windows in horizontal sheets. The lighthouse beam swept through the darkness, illuminating nothing but churning black water and jagged rocks. And then Eleanor saw her, A woman stood on the rocks below the lighthouse, barely visible through the spray and rain. She was wearing a white dress, the same dress Eleanor had seen in her mirror. The woman was waving her arms, beckoning, struggling against the waves. Eleanor screamed for her father, but the storm swallowed her voice. She grabbed a lantern and ran for the door. Her father saw nothing. He shouted after her, but Eleanor was already descending the cliff path, her feet slipping on the wet stones, her heart pounding with the desperate need to save the drowning woman. She reached the rocks. The waves crashed around her. She held up her lantern and searched the churning water. There was no one there. She turned to climb back up. Her foot caught on a slick stone. She fell. The freezing water closed over her head, pulling her down into darkness. As she drowned, something happened that defied every law of nature. The lighthouse's experimental electrical system, which her father had been testing for the Maritime Authority, discharged a massive pulse of energy. The pulse interacted with Eleanor's dying body in ways no one could have predicted. She was displaced backward through time, appearing as a ghostly projection 3 weeks earlier, visible only to herself. The woman Eleanor had seen on the rocks was not a stranger. It was Eleanor herself, dying, echoing backward through the weeks, appearing at the exact moment and location of her own death. She had climbed down to save herself. She had drowned trying to rescue her own ghost. Her father never spoke of that night. The lighthouse's electrical system was decommissioned immediately. The official reason was equipment malfunction. But buried in the Maritime Authority's archives is a single handwritten notation. Temporal interference suspected. Project terminated. Eleanor Byrne was not warned by a ghost. She was the ghost. And the specter that led her to the cliffs was nothing more than her own death, rippling backward through time. Number 3, the Twin Towers photograph. This case is deeply haunting, and it forces us to confront a question that has no comfortable answer. What would you sacrifice to save someone you love? Imagine traveling back in time to prevent the worst day in history. You find the person you lost. You tell them everything, and they do not believe you. That is exactly what happened to Michael Torres, and his desperate mission to save his wife ended with both of them dying in the same building on the same morning. Michael Torres lost his wife Angela on September 11, 2001. She worked on the 94th floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. She had kissed him goodbye that morning, the same way she did every morning, and walked out the door into a perfect blue sky. By the time the first plane struck, Michael was sitting at his desk across the city, watching the smoke rise through his office window. He never saw her again. For 23 years, Michael lived with a grief that never softened. He replayed that final morning endlessly in his mind. What if he had asked her to stay home? What if he had called her just a few minutes earlier? What if he had been there? The guilt consumed him, hollowed him out, turned him into a ghost haunting his own life. In 2024, according to documents that have circulated in classified intelligence forums, Michael volunteered for an experimental temporal displacement program. The technology was crude, dangerous, and offered only one-way travel. There was no return ticket. But Michael did not care. He had one goal: travel back to September 10, 2001, find Angela, get her out of the building before the planes arrived. The displacement worked. Michael materialized in New York City on the evening of September 10, 2001. He found Angela at their apartment, the same apartment they had shared for 3 years. She was cooking dinner. She smiled when she saw him, confused by his sudden appearance, by the tears streaming down his face. He told her everything: the planes, the towers collapsing, the 3,000 people who would die the next morning. He begged her not to go to work. Angela did not believe him. How could she? Her husband was standing in front of her, sobbing, describing an impossible catastrophe that had not happened yet. She thought he was having a breakdown. She called her sister, worried about his mental state. Michael grew desperate. He needed proof. He grabbed a newspaper from the kitchen counter, dated September 10, 2001, and held it up. He took a photograph of himself with the towers visible through the window behind him. "Look," he said. "Look at the timestamp. Look at the technology. This camera will not exist for another 20 years. Angela looked at the photograph. She looked at her husband, and she still did not believe. She went to bed that night convinced that Michael needed help. She woke up the next morning, kissed him goodbye, and walked out the door toward the subway. Michael followed her. He could not let her go alone. If he could not save her, he would at least be with her. He entered the North Tower minutes after she did. He was somewhere on the lower floors when American Airlines Flight 11 struck at 8:46 in the morning. He never reached the 94th floor. He never saw Angela again. The photograph was recovered from the debris months later. It was cataloged as an anomaly and immediately classified. The metadata embedded in the image showed timestamps from 2024. The geolocation data confirmed it was taken in Manhattan. The man in the photograph was smiling sadly, holding a newspaper, the towers standing tall and whole behind him. Michael Torres did not change history, he completed it. His name was added to the official death toll, listed among the victims who died in the North Tower. He had always been there. He just did not know it yet. The photograph remains classified to this day, but family members of victims have reported seeing it in unofficial archives. A man holding a newspaper, a window full of sky, 2 towers that would fall within hours, and a smile that knew exactly what was coming. Michael traveled through time to save his wife. Instead, he ensured they would die together. Some loops cannot be broken. Some losses cannot be undone. Number 2, the grandfather execution. This case is perhaps the most disturbing story we have covered because it reveals a truth so horrifying that most people refuse to accept it. Imagine traveling back in time to kill a monster. You find him, you end his life, and then you become him. That is exactly what happened to Daniel Mercer, and his quest to break a cycle of violence became the very thing that created it. Daniel Mercer grew up in the shadow of a man he never met. His grandfather, Thomas Mercer, was a name spoken only in whispers, a figure described in fragments of memory and half-told stories. Thomas had been a violent alcoholic who terrorized his wife and children in their small Ohio home during the early 1950s. He beat his son, Daniel's father, so severely that the boy carried the scars into adulthood. Then one night in October 1953, Thomas simply vanished. His body was never found. The family assumed he had abandoned them. They never spoke of him again. But the trauma did not vanish with him. Daniel's father inherited the rage, the darkness, the capacity for cruelty that seemed to run through the Mercer bloodline. He passed it on to Daniel, who spent his childhood flinching at raised voices and learning to read the danger in a room before anyone spoke. By the time Daniel reached adulthood, he had sworn to himself that the cycle would end with him. He would never become his father. He would never become his grandfather. In 2028, Daniel gained access to temporal displacement technology through underground channels. The black market for experimental tech had grown rapidly in the years following the first successful trials, and Daniel had connections. He had money, and he had a plan. He would travel back to October 1953, find Thomas Mercer before he could inflict any more damage, and kill him. He saw it as justice, as mercy, as the only way to finally break the chain. The displacement worked. Daniel materialized in a rain-soaked alley in Ohio on the night of October 17, 1953. He tracked Thomas to a bar on the edge of the town, watched him drink alone in a corner booth, followed him as he stumbled home through the dark streets. Daniel waited until Thomas entered the house. Then he followed him inside. The confrontation happened in the kitchen. Thomas turned, startled, and for a moment the two men stared at each other. Daniel expected to see a monster. Instead, he saw a broken man, drunk and confused, muttering about memories that had not happened yet. Thomas spoke of children he had not fathered, a grandson named Daniel, a life of violence he said he had already lived through once. His words made no sense. His eyes were filled with a recognition that should have been impossible. Daniel did not hesitate. He had come too far to turn back. He raised the weapon he had brought and fired twice. Thomas collapsed. The cycle was broken. The monster was dead. But something was wrong. The moment Thomas hit the floor, Daniel felt a strange sensation spreading through his body. His skin began to itch. His bones began to ache. He looked at his hands and watched them age before his eyes, the flesh thinning, the veins rising, the fingers curling into shapes that were not his own. The displacement technology had done something no one predicted. It was not just moving him through time, it was overwriting his identity, his DNA, his very existence. Daniel screamed, but the voice that came out was not his. It was deeper, rougher, thick with an accent he did not recognize. He stumbled to a mirror and saw Thomas Mercer staring back at him. He was displaced again, thrown further backward to 1920. He lived the next 33 years as Thomas Mercer. He married, he had children. He drank to forget a life he could no longer remember. and the violence that he had sworn to destroy became his own. Daniel did not kill his grandfather, he became his grandfather. Every beating his father endured was delivered by Daniel's own hands. Every scar, every nightmare, every broken bone was his doing. The cycle was never broken. It was the cycle, a closed loop of violence, guilt, and patricide that never had a beginning and will never have an end. Number 1, the final broadcast. This case is the most devastating example of a time traveler causing their own death, because it proves that sometimes the very act of warning the world is what dooms it. Imagine becoming the first person in history to successfully travel through time. You have hours to live. You use your final moments to send a message begging humanity to abandon the research that made your journey possible. And that message is what inspires you to begin. That is exactly what happened to Dr. Yuki Tanaka, and her story is a tragedy that will repeat itself forever. In the year 2089, according to fragments of documentation that have surfaced through classified leaks, Dr. Yuki Tanaka became the first human being to successfully transmit herself backward through time. She was a theoretical physicist who had spent her entire career chasing an impossible dream. And on the day she finally achieved it, she discovered that the dream was a nightmare. The energy required for temporal displacement was catastrophic. The moment Yuki materialized in the past, her cellular structure began to destabilize. Her atoms were tearing themselves apart at the molecular level. She had approximately 6 hours before complete dissolution, 6 hours to exist, 6 hours to decide what to do with the time she had left. She made a choice. If she could not save herself, she would save everyone who came after her. She would travel to a point before her research began, before the technology existed, and warn the world to never pursue it. She calculated the coordinates, locked in the destination, and activated the machine one final time. She arrived in the year 2031. The world was still decades away from understanding what she had accomplished. The technology that killed her had not yet been conceived. She had a chance to stop it all before it started. Yuki commandeered a broadcast station and transmitted her message across every available frequency: radio, television, the early global internet. Her face appeared on screens around the world, distorted by temporal interference, her voice crackling with static. She described the horrors of time travel, the deaths of early volunteers, the paradoxes that had unraveled reality in her timeline. She begged humanity to abandon temporal research. She pleaded with scientists to destroy their notes, their theories, their dreams of conquering time. The broadcast lasted 11 minutes. By the end, Yuki's body was flickering, her edges blurring, her voice fading into frequencies that human ears could not perceive. Her final words were a single plea, repeated over and over: "Do not build it, do not build it, do not build it." And then she was gone, dissolved, scattered across the time stream like ash in the wind. The broadcast made global headlines. Scientists debated its authenticity for decades. Philosophers argued about its implications. Governments launched investigations that produced no answers. But among those who watched the footage was a young physics student in Tokyo, a girl named Yuki Tanaka. She was 17 years old when she first saw the broadcast. The woman on the screen was old, dying, desperate, but something about her felt familiar. Something about her voice resonated in a way Yuki could not explain. She became obsessed with the footage. She studied every frame, every word, every flicker of distortion. And she asked herself a question that would define the rest of her life. If time travel was real enough to send a warning, could it be made safe? She dedicated her career to answering that question. 60 years later, in 2089, Dr. Yuki Tanaka activated her machine for the first time. She was thrown backward through time. Her cells began to destabilize. And with her final hours, she broadcast a warning to the world. The message did not prevent her research. The message began it. Without the broadcast, young Yuki would have become a chemist. Because of the broadcast, she invented time travel. She created herself. She warned herself. She killed herself. And she will do it forever. An endless loop of inspiration and destruction, cause and effect collapsing into a single point that can never be escaped. The broadcast still exists in archives around the world. The woman's face is blurred, her voice is distorted, but in the final seconds, before she dissolves completely, you can hear her whisper one word, over and over and over. Don't. 10 travelers, 10 deaths, and every single one caused by the very journey meant to prevent them. Is time a river that cannot be diverted, or a trap that punishes those who try? If you could travel through time, would you risk discovering that the worst moment of your life was always waiting for you, placed there by your own hand? Maybe the past isn't meant to be changed. Maybe it's already been changed by you.